Hey everyone, welcome to Base 10 Montessori. My name is Teresa, and today we're going to go over part 4 of the language development series. In part 1, we talked about how language develops. In part 2, we talked about those key predictors for reading and writing success. And then in part 3, we talked about all those activities that support those key predictors. And now in part 4, we're going to talk about how do we support children who are showing signs of struggling with reading and writing, and how do we support their families. So in this video, we're going to show 5 components of support. And the first component is going to be multisensory education. The second component is going to be time management and giving extra time for the child. And then the third one is going to be repetition. The fourth one is going to be about supporting the child's memory system. And then number 5 is how do we support the families. So that first component is multisensory education. It's a multisensory approach to learning. And with this multisensory approach, we're going to use a lot of materials, a lot of concrete objects. We could use Play-Doh, we can use glitter, we can use sand, any way that the child can experience that information in a kinesthetic, tactile, visual, or auditory way. We're going to include all of those different senses into our lesson plans. We can also incorporate visual or movement cues with letters and words to help the child retrieve information more quickly. So not only are we using a multisensory approach to help the child learn the information and experience the information, but we're going to use a multisensory approach to help the child retrieve the information from their long-term memory. So an idea of this would be finger tapping. When you're trying to sound out a word, you can tap your fingers to help isolate those sounds, to segment those sounds. You can also do arm pounding for learning to spell words. You could associate images with letters, like using the picture of an apple for the sound for A, which is ah. If the child is having a hard time remembering that sound for A, show them the picture of the apple and see if they can figure out, oh yeah, that's ah. Also, you can use hand movements. If the child is having trouble learning the sound for A, use the hand movement of eating an apple to help the child remember, oh yeah, that's ah. What we really want to do here is look for ways to help a child store information so that it is retained in the long-term memory. We want to stimulate different areas of the brain with these multisensory methods. And we also want to find the child's strengths. What are they good at? How can you incorporate that into their learning? When the child is really good at something, it has a positive association with the information that they're learning. That also is a sign that something in that area of the brain works really well. So why not use that? The next component is time management, because it's going to take longer for the child to put information into long-term memory. It's going to take a lot longer for the child to take the information that you're trying to give them, process that information, store that information into short-term memory, and then store that information again into long-term memory. And then once we get it into long-term memory, it's going to take that child a lot longer to retrieve that information. So just giving extra time for the child to process the information and to respond to the information is going to help them succeed with reading and writing. When you ask them a question, expect them to take longer to answer you, because it's going to take longer for them to access that long-term memory. And again, we're going to want to use those multisensory approaches to help them retrieve that information out of long-term memory. And remember, when the child is learning to store information into long-term memory, it's going to be very common for that information to get lost. It's going to be very common for them to forget that information. This is something that happens a lot when you're working with a child with a learning disability. They're going to be very inconsistent at remembering their lessons. So yes, this takes extra time. And if you're working at a 1:30 ratio, like I do in my classroom, then giving those extra lessons and giving the extra time to repeat lessons is often very difficult. So just keep in mind that we need to advocate that children with disabilities do take extra time, they do take extra support, and we need to remind our administration of this on a regular basis. Now let's talk a little bit about repetition. In Orton-Gillingham training, we do a 3-part drill in every single lesson. We have an auditory drill, a visual drill, and a blending drill. When it comes to the auditory drills, the teacher is going to say the sound and the child is going to write it or create the symbol of that sound. In the visual drill, the teacher is going to show the letter, and then the child is going to make the sound associated with that letter. And then the blending drill is when we take those isolated letter sounds and we start blending them together to make a word. And I have a website that goes over this information that might help you out. So let's switch over and look at that website right now. So here we are, and this is on BrainSpring, so brainspring.com. And it reminds me a lot of my Orton Gillingham training, so I like what they put here. And they talk about the 3-part lesson. And they're talking right here about this auditory drill. What does it look like? And it says, teachers ask students to spell the sound they hear. Sounds chosen should only be sounds that have been previously introduced. So there's the auditory drill, and it gives an example right here. So show me how to spell the sound B. And so the student can use whatever method they would like to write the sound. Sometimes it's a sand tray. Sometimes they could do that. They could even do that with Play-Doh, right? Or they could use the chalkboard. They could use a pencil. It's up to you how you want them to write the sound. So it goes over a little bit more of that auditory drill right there, but then it also gives the visual drill. And it talks about right here, what is that 3-part drill? And then what does the visual drill look like? And what it says here is students look at previously learned sound cards and then they say the sound they see. And yes, you can do this in a group setting. I would advise a very small group setting, but if the child is really struggling with reading and writing, you really should be one-on-one. So there's a little more information on the visual drill. And a lot of times what I do is I just tell the child, I'm going to show you the cards and I'm going to see how quickly you can tell me the sounds. And so I'll show them the cards and they'll say D, A, T, K. Every time they see the letter, they'll just see how fast they can say the letter. And then blending. All right, so for blending, this is more of an advanced blending lesson because it has a consonant blend and a consonant digraph. So what we're doing here is when we're working only with the sounds, only with the letters the child is familiar with, the ones that they've mastered, the ones that they're working on mastering. So right here, we're going to show how they're isolated. We're going to sound it out, right? Fl, ah, sh. So those sounds are all separate right there, and we have to bring them together. We have to say it faster. The blending process is really figuring out how to take those isolated sounds and bring them together to make a word. So I will drop a link to this website down below the video so that you have access to it and you can search through it. They've got a lot of different plans. They have what's called Multisensory Monday with a lot of different plans. And from what I've seen, it's a pretty good resource. I think I'm going to use it for some different ideas for myself as well. So I'll drop that link down below for you. And let's go back to looking at repetition again. So we want to have consistent drills. We want to have a consistent way of doing things, and we need to repeat that on a regular basis. Now, for the 3 to 6 year old age group, we don't want to go overboard. We don't want to force the child to work too long on this. The goal for my age group, for that 3 to 6 age group, is really 10 to 15 minutes a day, at least 3 times a week, for children who are struggling with phonological awareness, with phonemic awareness, with the phonics system. So doing 10 to 15 minutes a day of these auditory drills, the visual drills, and the blending drills is going to be really helpful. But keep in mind that children with learning disabilities cannot auto-educate. That means that you can't just show them this information once and have them master it. A lot of children can auto-educate, and in fact, Montessori education is built on that auto-education. The Montessori methods still work with children with learning disabilities, but it's not in the same way, right? Because we have to have an adult-oriented lesson. We have to have adult-oriented activities, and we're going to have to go back to that child and work with them more often, offer these extra lessons, offer this repetition, because the child is not going to go back and repeat the lessons on their own when they have a learning disability. In fact, usually when they have a learning disability, they are going to avoid those lessons. And there's a lot of different reasons why. And one reason why is because they're insecure. They compare themselves to their peers and they'll say, well, you know what? I already know that I don't understand something about this, that I'm not getting this as quickly as my friend is. And they'll pick up on that really quickly, even in that 3 to 6 environment. So we need to be aware of that. But also, they're not going to go back to lessons that they can't remember well. They're going to gravitate to the lessons that stick with them very clearly. And so we cannot expect them to auto-educate in the areas that they're showing a learning disability in. So keep that in mind, and keep in mind, even though in Montessori we really like to be independent, children who are struggling do need to have a lot of adult leadership. They're going to need more time with an adult. They're going to need more time being led back to the lessons that they're struggling with. And why is repetition important? Maria Montessori talked a lot about repetition, and she said it is exactly in the repetition of the exercises that the education of the senses exists. Not that the child shall know colors, forms, or qualities, but that he refine his senses through an exercise of attention, comparison, and judgment. So that's what we want from the child. We want this repetition. We want them to be precise. We want them to perfect themselves. But a child who's struggling with a learning disability is going to deviate from that repetition. And that means that not only are they struggling with it, they're struggling with the repetition of it as well. And that repetition is going to be what brings their attention around, right? It helps them focus. It helps them compare. It helps them judge. It helps them focus their attention. Maria Montessori also said to have learned something for the child is only a point of departure. When he has learned the meaning of an exercise, he begins to enjoy repeating it. And he does repeat it an infinite number of times with the most evident satisfaction. So think about that for a second with a child who has a learning disability, with a child who is really struggling with something. He hasn't learned the meaning of the exercise. A child who is struggling with phonological awareness, the child who is struggling with that sound symbol relationship, hasn't learned the meaning of the exercise. And that is why they don't repeat it, right? They don't repeat it because they don't understand the meaning of it. They haven't figured out the sound symbol relationship. There is something missing there. And a lot of the time, that goes back to that memory system. So we can't expect them to repeat it because they haven't learned the meaning of the exercise. And when they start learning the meaning, when they start understanding it, that's when they go back and repeat it. It has to mean something to them first. And again, when we're talking about the different areas of the brain, stimulating the different areas of the brain through multisensory education, using something that means something to the child and associating it with what they're struggling with is going to help bring meaning to that exercise. And through that, they may start repeating it. Another component is helping the memory system, supporting the memory system through chunking information. Now, with older children, we can use techniques called web maps or thought maps. And I just want to go over this article, and I'll drop a link to it down below as well. And it says, many studies have shown the efficacy of putting word meaning into graphic form, such as a map or a web, or a semantic feature chart, advanced organizer, or other graphic form. It is critical to note, however, the mere construction of such maps without discussion is not effective. So we need to not only offer this visual aid, but we have to have a discussion about it as well. We have to have multisensory input for the child. It goes on to say there are other approaches that stress actively relating words to one another as well. These include clustering strategies that call for students to group words into related sets, brainstorming, grouping, and labeling, designing concept hierarchies or constructing definition maps related to concept hierarchies, and mapping words according to their relation to story structure categories. So, for example, here they give the example of hawk, and then the different ideas, bird, migrates. So all these different components of what's related to hawk. So this is something you can do for older children. We can help start chunking information together. All these separate ideas, all these separate words, we can bring them together. Also, word families help. Word families help the child chunk information together. So instead of remembering that as two different sounds, you can help the child chunk the information together by bringing it together into one sound, at. Now, we still go through and we introduce all those sounds individually, So we're not skipping the process of individually associating the sound symbol relationship. But once they've done that, we can start helping the child identify commonalities through word families. We can also do this through consonant blends. It's the same thing. Instead of understanding that C and the L are two different sounds, we can help the child by saying, okay, now let's put these two sounds together, and we can notice that there are a lot of words that use these two consonant blends together, and we'll just say them as one sound. And with word families, I've noticed that children who have issues with blending, who have a lot of difficulty with blending, I've found that with word families, if you show the child that you can blend starting with that middle sound with the vowel sound and that ending sound, so again, let's use the example of A and T. If you help them blend at, just those two sounds together, and then put on that beginning sound for that CVC word, which is consonant, vowel, consonant, then they seem to be able to blend it more quickly. So children who have gotten stuck on that blending issue, start with the middle sound, start with the vowel and blend to the ending sound, and then go back and stick on a beginning sound, like cat, sat, mat. So chunking that information is really going to help the child store the information more efficiently. Now let's talk a little bit about supporting families. One thing that I really like to do for all my students, not just my students who are struggling, is to send home booklets of new lessons, to document things, send it home. For instance, when I introduce 3 new sounds from my sandpaper letters, let's say I have a 3-year-old who's learning all the sounds in the alphabet with the sandpaper letters. I introduce 3 new sounds at a time. And when I introduce those 3 new sounds, I'm going to put them in a little booklet for the child. So I'm going to say, all right, let's learn our 3 sounds. And once you've learned them, we're going to make a little booklet. And once the child gets their book, they can decorate it if they want, and then they get to take it home and show their parents. Now, this is a great way for parents to understand what we did this week when it comes to the language area. And also, taking that little book home shows the parents, oh, you're working on the S, the A, and the T. Let's see if we can find little games that we can play. Let's play I Spy. Let's look for those letters in books and make those sounds. Let's sound that out. So that just shows the parents what they can put extra emphasis on. What new lesson can they help out with at home? And that's one of the biggest questions I get at parent-teacher conferences is, what can we do at home to help? What kind of support can we give here in the home environment? Letter books are a great way to do that. And you can do the exact same thing with phonograms. You can do that with sight words as well. Another thing that we really want to make sure we're doing is invite parents for observations. In Montessori, parent observations are really important. I don't think this is something they do in traditional schools. I don't remember parents coming in for observations when I was in public school. But in Montessori, we want parents in there. We want to be transparent. We want the parents to see the classroom. This not only gives the parent the idea of, hey, this is what my child's doing every single day, but it also shows them, well, what are other children doing? They can watch their child, but they can watch the other children. And sometimes that really helps give parents perspective about what their child is learning and what other children are learning. And that might stimulate a lot of discussion. So making time for parents to see what's going on, to be involved with the learning process before it gets to parent-teacher conferences is going to really be a lot of help. And also think about starting some parent education programs. You can start out with parent education nights and just go over what your expectations are. Tell parents what's going on in the room. Tell them about your strategies for learning. What are the materials you use? But in addition to just understanding how your program works, having a structured program set up for children who are struggling, especially when it comes to reading and writing, making sure you're implementing a structured program so that parents can follow along at home and support you in the home environment is really important. Making sure you have a plan, a structured plan. So my best advice is try to come together and create a system of, this is how I introduce sounds. This is the order I introduce sounds. This is how I communicate that to parents. And this is how I provide that information to parents. And that concludes part 4 of the language development series. So now that we've finished the entire language development series, parts 1, 2, 3, and 4, I'm going to get more into the actual lesson plans, showing you what the lesson presentations look like, and showing you a little bit more about how to do the lesson planning when it comes to reading and writing. So if you like what I said here today, if you like what we're doing, go ahead, give this video a thumbs up, like, share, comment, subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.